Alright lads, welcome back to another Stogie Lad Cigar video. This is a topic that I recently felt the urge to touch on again. It is the state of Cuban cigars. This is a topic that we could have put in a podcast, but I don't think there's quite enough to make a whole episode of it, so I felt a separate video, just a one-to-one chat like this, was probably the best way to do it. So some background, why I felt like I need to go back to this. We made some videos on the Cuban price crisis, as we called it, last year, where Cuba Habanos decided to skyrocket the prices and set a worldwide standard that is pinned to the Hong Kong prices. If you don't know about that still, check out that video. I'm not going to talk about the pricing again because that is not quite relevant to what I am discussing. This is more of a topic regarding the agricultural state of Cuba. So, I recently posted on Instagram that I found some of the new releases, the Monte Cristo White Edmundo and the new Ramon Allones number 3. I finally got my hands on these in Sweden, but what I saw shocked me. So as you see in the video playing over now, both these cigars have quite visible sunspots on the back. And this might sound dramatic to make a whole video about that, but I have never ever seen a first release Cuban cigar that isn't perfect. I talk about this a lot in my reviews. I've made reviews of the Por la Reñaga Galanes, the Punch Short the Punch. A few of these first release Cuban cigars, the Rafael Gonzalez Coronas Alonso was the most recent one. Now, historically, Cuba has been perfect in their first release edition cigars. When they release a new cigar to the market, as I normally talk about, they want the first ones to be perfect so the consumer is positively surprised with the product and then they want to go back, right? But this is the first time in all these years I've ever seen a first edition Cuban cigar look as poor as they do. Now, the sunspot thing I'll come back to later because that means a lot more than you might think again. But this is just such a impactful sight that I felt like, I wanted to address the situation in Cuba. So I have a lot of discussions with people in the industry that don't really make it out to the public. I also am a true cigar nerd. I mean, I read about cigars every day. I probably spend a couple of hours just reading about the industry and the state of cigars. And there's a lot of figures that I see that probably aren't really that public knowledge. So I wanted to just sort of address some of this stuff. I also feel like the average casual consumer probably knows that Cuba is not in a good situation right now, but is probably most knowledgeable about the price situation, right? Because that's what we see on the shelves. So the price crisis aside, like I said, I feel like we are now entering what is a true agricultural crisis in Cuba. So I've talked to some people that have recently traveled to Cuba. I actually talked to a tobacco farmer in Cuba also a couple months ago. And what I've heard is quite dire. Cuba had some bad hurricanes. A lot of the curing barns were knocked down. The Cuban farmers have not gotten enough money from the government to rebuild these. So a lot of them are making sort of provisional curing barns I've seen, and they're really of poor quality. Secondly, the harvests are extremely small. Last year, Cuba actually reported the lowest harvest in the entire history of Cuban cigars. And, that's over 200 years. So that is quite awful regarding the fact that we have such an insane demand of Cuban cigars right now. That's really worrying. A lot of the curing barns that I've heard people visit are very empty, very, very empty, some of them entirely empty. There's just not enough tobacco produced on the island. So to give perspective, Cuba as a cigar producing nation has sort of been hovering around 100 million plus cigars, usually in their history. Sometimes that's gone down, sometimes that's gone up. They've been close to 200 million in their peaks. And the worst ever situation they were in the mid-80s because of mold and other diseases affecting the crops, they were down to about 50 million a year. They recovered and they got up to the 100 mark later on, but it's been slowly on a decline in the recent years. So in the last couple of decades, it's gone down from that 100 to 80 to 75, and now the reports that I've heard from Cuba the last year was that last year Cuba produced about 50 million cigars. So we are back to that worst state ever in Cuba. And again, with a reflection that the demand is as high as it's ever been in the last, couple decades, that is dire. That is really, really grim. We have massive demand and Cuba is producing less than they've ever done. So again, in the mid-80s, they had a massive crisis. They went down to that number that we are at now. The Cuban government felt that this was a complete crisis. They replaced the head of Cuba Tobacco, which was the company name at the time, and they restructured a lot. They brought in agronomists to try to help out and get a hold of the agricultural situation. So that's how bad it was in the 80s, that they felt like it was a complete crisis, and we are there again. And it's not maybe being talked about enough, I feel. So again, a reason why I'm talking about this as an agricultural problem is there's been a problem with synthetic fertilizers in the entire world. That's been a global problem. However, Cuba, with their economic situation, with their government situation, they have not been able to compensate as well as other countries. So the lack of fertilizer has made farming extremely difficult in Cuba. Now that's something that of course has impacted everyone, so you can't blame Cuba entirely, but again, the government situation makes it so difficult for the farmers there. But beyond that, the way that the demand has impacted the agriculture in Cuba has also been ruining the harvests. So in agriculture, usually you need what is called a fallow year. Now this is getting quite technical, but if you truly are a cigar nerd, you need to get into the agricultural side as well. A fallow year is basically letting the earth rest. So putting it in extremely simple terms, if you keep harvesting and planting the same crop over and over on the same plot of land, it's going to suck out all the nutrients and that land is going to become ruined. In Cuba, they are not doing this properly. They are so pushed because of the demand, and they need to produce as much as possible, that they just keep going, and they are sucking all the life out of that land and ruining it. So if you feel like the cigars taste poor, perhaps it's the tobacco that's just coming from extremely poor soils. This also means that, of course, they cannot harvest, and a lot of land is being ruined. And this is coming from people that have seen it firsthand. They're seeing a lot of unused land because it's just not usable. And of course, that is being reflected in the produced quantity and the harvests. That's a really sad fact. So, with the background on all of this stuff, why are these sunspots such a dramatic thing? Well, in the entire history of cigars, right? The entire history, sunspots are a massive no-no. They have always been something that you cannot put on a premium cigar wrapper. Now, you might have seen sunspots before. They sometimes sneak themselves into cigars if it's a mistake, but with Cuban cigars recently, I have been seeing them on everything. Non-Cuban brands often sort sunspot wrappers because they're still smokable, right? And before you comment, oh, sunspots don't really matter to the taste, that is true, but it's the standard of quality that is the case here. So non-Cuban cigar manufacturers usually sort these wrappers into, second, third edition cigars. They're bundle cigars, they're cheaper stuff. Because at the end of the day, it's still fine. It's just something that historically, because of the standard of quality that we want in a premium Cuban cigar or non-Cuban cigar, wrappers with sunspots are not supposed to go on a high-quality, premium, top-level cigar. You will never in your entire life see a Davidoff with a sunspot. That's just a fact, right? You will not see a Davidoff cigar with a Davidoff band, their premium line with a sunspot. It will never, ever happen. Same with Arturo Fuente, for example, with their higher-end stuff, right? You will never, ever see it. And again, the reason why I'm touching on this so much is when they're finding their way onto every single first edition cigar, that is insanely worrying. It's showing that not only are the harvests going down, and we know that, but Cuba is completely dropping a historical standard, something that's been the case for hundreds of years, right? They're completely disregarding the standard that we expect from a Cuban premium cigar. And of course, you can talk about the roll quality, and that's been the case for a long time, right? The quality of the rolling has been poor. But you can sort of hide that, right? When you open a box of cigars, you don't really see a tight draw, right? So this is so much more symbolic. This is sort of showing that they're shameless in the fact that they don't care anymore to uphold the standard that at least they were pretending to uphold before. And I feel like they're probably justifying this with the fact that they can't afford to care about that anymore. But at the end of the day, we're seeing something shift massively in the outside quality. Again, sunspots don't matter in the flavor, yes, but it's sort of like buying a Rolex. If you're seeing a little misprint on the dial, you're never gonna see that. They would never produce a premium watch with a little misprint. It's sort of the same thing. I should not be buying a new Cuban cigar for close to $20 and having sunspots on it. It's just not the historical quality of cigars. That's not how it's supposed to be. So it's being extremely clearly reflected now. The quality is dropping on every single level, sadly. Beyond that, some other crazy statistics that I've heard from the Habanos Festival from people that were going, rolling tables and rolling rooms are still at about 50% capacity. So only half of the rollers tables are filled. This is because of a mass exodus. Cuba was in a completely horrific state during COVID. Of course, the economy was poor overall in the world, but Cuba was hit very, very hard, and a lot of people fled. A lot of Cuban cigar rollers fled, and they still haven't been able to fill those seats. It takes a long time to teach a roller to roll well enough to even be able to make a cigar at all, let alone a poorly rolled one. So it's taking them a long time to even find people to roll in the first place, and then of course to teach them how to do it. Some other figures I think people might not know. The Cuban cigar rollers, I want you to guess before I say how much they make a month, because it is quite grim. They do make about 15 to 25 US dollars a month, so it's not a lot to live on. Again, another reason why these rollers are fleeing to Nicaragua, where it's not even on the same planet, the amount that you make as a roller. And even, compared to European standards, a Nicaraguan roller is not making a lot, but compared to Cuba, it's night and day. And lastly, I know some people that own big cigar stores in Sweden, so I've, sometimes I drop by and I get to go behind the scenes and see their distribution and their packing and stuff. And I've been able to see them sort boxes and stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of Cuban cigar boxes where the coloring is sorted horrifically. The wrappers are completely broken on delivery. Some boxes where half of the box is really dark like a Maduro and the other half is, sort of this English market shade. It's dropping. It's dropping on every front, and Cuba don't seem to care because I feel like they think they cannot afford to care. They still need to make enough cigars to try to come close to settling demand, which they still aren't. So what is the point of this video? Well, mostly it is just to sort of bring to light some of these issues, to make people a little more aware that it's not just a pricing thing. Cuba didn't just want to put up the prices for the fun of it. There's a lot going on behind these decisions going on in Cuba. So am I telling you to stop buying Cuban cigars? Well, not entirely. I mean, I'm not boycotting them. Of course, that would be hypocritical. I just told you guys that I bought a few new ones. But personally, to share, I'm not buying Cuban cigars in the same way that I used to anymore. I'm not buying regular production stuff. I'm just buying these new editions. I feel like as I make these reviews, and I have this sort of connection to the community, I feel it's still relevant to try whatever new stuff is hitting the market. But I am not really consuming Cuban cigars in the same way anymore. And the reason is Trifold. I mean, firstly, it is a small little protest to the Habanos company. And again, there is a smidge of irony because I'm still buying some Cuban cigars. But I'm still not, I don't feel comfortable really supporting that company as much anymore. And again, before you get angry because you like Cuban cigars, it's still completely fine. I love Cuban cigars. I just do not like Habanos as a company. And I don't think there's any smoker out there that does like Habanos. If there is, please contact me and let me know why you like Habanos. I feel like they don't really do anything well, and I would really like to hear what you think is good about the company. Secondly, I've slowly started to shift towards that feeling that it doesn't feel right. I get a little bit of a bad feeling in my gut when I buy Cuban cigars nowadays. Just knowing how poor the conditions are for the rollers and how little they earn and all that stuff is sad. And I've talked to some ex-Cuban rollers that fled, actually. I've talked to some people on Zoom. I've, again, also talked to farmers there. It's just such a bad situation. It makes me feel so bad for the people. And that's just me being candid about the fact that, I've started to, over the years, feel worse and worse about consuming Cuban cigars, and it is starting to affect me more. And then lastly, the last issue is mostly just a selfish reason. I mean, the quality is so poor now. And before, I know a lot of Americans love to comment, 50% of Cubans are unsmokable. That's not at all true. That's an absurd exaggeration. I feel like mostly at worst it's been 1 out of 10, so 10% are poor. And of course, that's an awful ratio, right? I mean, imagine buying a case of wine and having 1 of the 10 bottles be undrinkable. That you would feel like that would be crazy, right? So the fact that it's been about 10% in my experience, that's really bad already. But I feel like that's slowly creeping up, and sometimes I'm getting Cuban cigars and 2 out of 10 or even more are really poorly rolled. So that's just a selfish reason why, I just feel like the product quality is so bad nowadays that I don't feel like it's worth it, especially with the prices. But the prices really is a more minor thing compared to this other stuff. So there you have a little bit of an update on my view on Cuban cigars right now, a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes from what I've been able to gather through talking to different people. It's a sad situation. I am worried about it. We will see how it continues with the new pricing. But stuff like this, these sunspots on the new editions, this just tells me this is the best that they could put out. This is really the best they could do. That's really, really quite worrying. So, it's weird to say it, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as you can, this sort of topic. And I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.